Oh, I'm not afraid to stir the pot. The best kind of drama, save it for your mama, is when it's the truth. I know this video is going to ruffle more than a few feathers. Can I tell you a secret? I wanted it to, because I love the chaos. This video is for you and me. We are not the typical person. We actively seek out information about money and the markets on this platform. For most people, putting money into an S&P 500 ETF and simply waiting is the best move. It's what the historical data says works in the long term. If it all goes according to plan, it should in theory continue to keep working out. But you and I know there are problems with just taking information at the surface level. We want to dive in. We want to know what's up with that thing on the backside. Suggestive. If you didn't know, I'm not like the other finance girlies out there, because even as good as the S&P 500 is, it has its cons. If we know about those issues, we can then find solutions so we can better secure ourselves from these risks. Hi, I'm Raj. I have childhood trauma that stems from being poor growing up, so instead of going to therapy, I make these videos. That is 100% accurate. If you thought this was financial advice, please don't think that. Let's get started. So problem number one, most investors will at best underperform the market. This sounds strange, but the reason is actually very simple. If the market is considered the S&P 500, this is the benchmark we use to determine if investing in something was a good idea or a bad move. You beat the S&P 500, good job, you smart, you got a cookie. You make less than the S&P 500, bad job, you dumb, no cookie. The problem is that investing in the 500 largest companies by market cap would require you to buy 500 individual stocks and manage 500 positions. I would argue most of us have better things to do. Imagine if you missed one, or if those companies drop out of the top stocks and a new one replaces it, which literally happens all the time. I'm not saying you should be lazy. I'm just saying that that's a lot of work. A much easier way is to just buy an ETF or a basket of stocks that holds all of them. Now, that convenience and hands-off approach typically comes with a fee called an expense ratio. That's when a fund manager will charge us for owning the ETF. So they make money managing money. That's the real infinite money glitch right there. Go into finance, kids. Of the ETFs that offer exposure to the S&P 500, you've probably noticed there are typically some of the cheapest funds to own by comparison. But still, those small percentage points of fees do add up over time and are not immediately noticeable in the accounts. I'm not sure if there is a way to see how much an investor has paid over the years, but you're still paying the fees if you own an ETF, which means if you own an S&P 500 fund and it kept up 1-to-1 with the market, you technically didn't keep up with the market because of the fees. Now, let's not get too carried away here. In my opinion, it's still worth it to pay those fees. Absolutely, just from a management perspective alone, and because you'll probably pay more in fees buying 500 companies individually. But that does lead to a far more concerning issue, which is by buying a manager's fund, you buy into the manager's strategy, which leads us to problem number two. The S&P 500 has a problem with a lack of diversification. Like, imagine if you had a football team and everyone was a quarterback. Who's gonna catch the ball? It only accounts for the top 500 companies in the US market and completely ignores the thousands of other publicly traded US companies. Seriously, I googled it, it's thousands. Oh, and that doesn't factor in the fact that we're missing out on the entire rest of the world. Isn't it insane that Toyota and Honda are claimed to be some of the best cars to own to build wealth for their reliability, low cost to maintain, and resale value, but just buying the S&P 500 doesn't give you exposure to them? I'm not saying go all in on Japanese auto manufacturer stocks. It's just to prove a point. You're missing key companies that you may think very highly of. And I love my Subaru. 85% Japanese parts. They don't miss. The Japanese make the best stuff. How do they do it? Why do these cows taste so good? Their cartoons are literally better. I'm a grown adult and I still want to watch them. I want to know what's the secret sauce. In addition, the ETFs we buy further decrease our diversification, because when we buy these S&P 500 based ETFs, the holdings are not equally balanced. They typically hold more of the very top companies by market cap and less of the lower ones on the list. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, and it seems like popular ETFs that focus on the S&P 500 have a solid record of keeping up with the market. But again, this is something to keep in mind. And another thing to consider is problem number three. There is no focus on income from the S&P 500. Yes, some companies pay a dividend, which is paid to investors, but typically the dividends from the S&P 500 are so small you would need a microscope. Sorry, just kidding. A very large amount of money in the ETF for any significant payout. Now, this isn't typically a problem since most of us are investing for the long term to grow our money, not to live off of now, but to live off of later. The thing to remember is that what you get out of the investment is dependent on the investment returns, how much money you put in, and how long you invested. Most people do not have millions of dollars for retirement in their retirement accounts. That's just what the raw data says. But if you do, you are potentially relying on the 4% rule. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule. This is more of a general guideline. This is basically saying every year starting in retirement, you can sell 4% of your portfolio and live off of that amount. You would not touch the rest of the principal. You would keep it in the market, let it continue to grow, and you can theoretically continue to sell 4% every year and do this until you no longer need the money. That doesn't account for market fluctuations, inflation, increased expenses, and taxes, but worst of all, this requires selling your assets that you accumulated for decades, and that's not very appealing. But there's also a very real danger called sequence risk. Basically, if you're selling your assets in a down year, that's more expensive than selling your position in an up year, because in order to get the same amount of money you would need to live, you would have to sell more shares to do so, because that's just how the math works out. So your money runs out faster than it would have if you first sold in an up year, and this could mean a significant difference in how your retirement looks. Don't worry, my childhood trauma has me constantly playing defense. We'll get to some solutions for this, but first, problem number 4. We are basing future performance on past performance, and the future is unknown. Every single dollar in the S&P 500 is at best a bet on the United States. We know from history that the US has not always been the economic powerhouse of the world. In the future, that may change. As investors in the S&P 500 or products that are based off of it, we are all wanting the same thing, the continued growth of the S&P 500, but that will depend on how the story of Earth unfolds. So this is the part where people say it's all doom and gloom, we can't do anything to help ourselves, blah, blah, blah. I'm an optimist. I'm one of the worst people to argue with. So let's get to the solutions to the issues at hand. Remember, the enemy is not the S&P 500. The enemy is getting further away from our financial goals. Let's get closer to them by growing our money. So solution number 1, buy the S&P 500. To be fair, it's hard to outcompete the S&P on the long term. The solution is to just keep buying because this is the safest horse in the race, and to do it as cheaply as possible. Find a low-cost ETF, VOO is a great option, and keep dollar cost averaging. Solution number 2, buy other ETFs that offer exposure to the rest of the US market. VTI, for example, lets you buy the entire US market, and there are plenty of international ETFs that let you buy into non-US companies. You could take a little more risk and go with individual stocks. Quick tip, be sure to watch out for overlap, meaning, for example, if you buy both VTI and VOO, evaluate the holdings. You'll see you're double dipping in exposure based on what they each own. Don't mistakenly concentrate your holdings thinking you're diversifying, and you might want to also consider buying individual stocks. I would only recommend this after doing a ton of research and being very comfortable with the known risks. Solution number 3, consider income and dividend paying ETFs as core portfolio positions or as supplemental positions. Dividend ETFs like SCHD have a long history of success for paying and growing a dividend, and newer covered call ETFs like JEPI and JEPQ and several others we've talked about on this channel help you earn income with your money in a very hands-off way without selling your shares. And solution number 4, invest outside of the markets. It could be your own skills and knowledge you use to provide services to people, real estate to collect rental income, even high-risk plays like cryptocurrency for some people may prove to be beneficial, or anything else you can think of. But of course, it's all risk versus reward. The best thing for you might not be the best thing for me or anyone else. The greatest part of personal finance is that it's personal, so no one is wrong. That also means no one is right too, so keep that in mind. There is no perfect investment, but in this day and age we live in today, there is no limit to how much you can earn in a single day, week, year, and lifetime. You just have to start somewhere, and getting informed like you just did is a great way to do that. Thanks for letting me stir the pot. I hope you like the soup.